It's my pleasure to introduce the other half of Rich and Tom. And I've just known Tom, Dr. Tom Travison, for a couple years now, mostly through the boot camp at NIDUS and Harvard. But he's a wealth of knowledge, director of biostatistics and co-director of interventional studies in aging at the Institute for Aging Research, assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, Beth Israel. He's a biostatistician and a clinical trialist whose work focuses on the epidemiology and treatment of illnesses of aging. His recent work has been particularly focused on strategies for testing multimodal interventions for complex illnesses. He has served as investigator or lead statistician on multiple large longitudinal studies, including the Massachusetts Male Aging Study, the Boston Area Community Health Study, and I believe you work on the Sharon studies, the multiple large SAGES studies that you've heard a lot about. And I also got to sit with him at one of the tables, so he taught me a little bit about work-career balance. So join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Travison.
Thanks, guys. And even though I'm the one presenting this half of the talk, I want to emphasize that this is joint work between Rich and myself. We have about an hour. You can break in with questions. I'm sort of an informal speaker. You guys should feel free to jump in at any time. You can see what we're going to talk about is mock study proposal methods review. There are 8 proposals that were submitted, so we'll just kind of go through them. I know everyone's very excited about having an external statistician sort of scrutinize your plan. But I promise you that this will be pretty much kind and gentle. But I do have some introductory comments before we get into it. One of them I want to say is that we're going to sort of take excerpts from the methodology that you guys have discussed in your proposals and use them to illustrate concepts. So this is not meant as a comprehensive review. You have received that in the mock study proposal. It's also available from people like Rich and myself during the lunch today or by email. We'll spotlight each proposal, talk about aims a little bit, and then highlight 1 or 2 concepts or 1 or 2 areas of improvement. And I do want to say we are focusing on areas for improvement, right? So we spent the past few days telling you all about the science of delirium and yourselves and how amazing you are. And just by virtue of sitting in this room, we know that you're a select group of people. I'm not going to continue to reiterate that, but to sort of reinforce something that Wes was talking about a moment ago and that Rich talked about earlier. These are your proposals. This is your career. This is your science. And even though you get a lot of input from folks like us and your mentors and collaborators and so on and so forth, in the end, you're writing the grants, and ultimately you're going to be the world's expert in a particular thing that it's focused on. So at the end of the day, you have to trust your instincts on what we're telling and take it with, a grain or a boulder of salt, depending on the context. And finally, in interpreting your work and reading what you've written, there will be misunderstanding, right? It just comes with the territory. Your colleagues around here and yourselves probably can tell you about experiences where you've written something and you get a critique back from, very prestigious, if anonymous colleagues who will say, it would have been wonderful if you said the following, or you did this, or, an enormous weakness of this proposal is the following thing was not discussed or included, and you're like, it's on page 7. It's also on page 9. It's also in my bio sketch, right? And I say this, I'm kidding, but I'm not really kidding. It's not that, it's you, right? You have to have the attitude of you have to bring them, as Lucy was saying, as Rich reiterated, you have to tell them what they need to know, and if they're not hearing it, you are not saying it in a way that's coming across. I've reviewed hundreds of pilot applications through the Boston Pepper Center and other places, and I've spent more time on your proposals here than I typically would on one that was submitted there when we received 20 or 30 for 2 slots. And I'm telling you right now that when we look at the next 30 slides or so, I'm going to say things that aren't true, right? Even though I have spent more time on your proposals and taken a very keen interest in what you're doing. And again, I'm a pretty smart guy, right? So it's going to be mostly, to me, our shared fault, but mostly your fault. Right? And I just want you to accept that and come to terms with how unfair that is, and just realize that that's how it is. Right? We have to have somewhat thick skins, and I can't tell you the number of times, dozens of times, where I've just felt like, But you have to learn to be strong in the face of this. So let's just go through the applications. First, Dr. Carini. The one thing I will say is if I misspell your name, that's totally and this is the format that we'll go through, just sort of reminding us of what the product is about, what the aims are, and some specific design features and inclusions that make it sort of unique that I just tried to highlight here. They're not necessarily the ones that you think are most important, but the ones that I'm going to use to illustrate some points here today. These are not in any particular order. It happens to be the case that Federico is the first alphabetically, but I'm not doing that. I'm just kind of skipping around with no rhyme or reason. Again, please stop me if you have specific questions, because there are some themes throughout this that may apply later on as well. So this is something called the A through F bundle combined with ICU diaries about experience in the ICU. And some design features of this particular application were that it was described by the applicant as being mixed methods, which is combining quantitative and qualitative research. And a particular goal in the quantitative portion, which we'll talk about today, is generation of some prevalence estimates in sort of what was called phase 1 of this application. Now, who knows what statistics is? Yeah, I don't have a definition.
Oh.
What is ACE? So it's the field of statistics. I teach a course called Statistics and Computing, which is like 2 entire fields of knowledge in one semester. Absurd, right, at BU. But I always ask, what is a statistic? And people say, what? Sorry? A data point can be a statistic. So like, for example, the height of the tallest person in this room. That would be one data point, which could be a statistic, which would be like the tallest, what we call an order statistic. We ordered everyone in height, right? So a statistic is a function of data, right? Any function at all. We typically think about means, averages, medians, and so on and so forth, but it's not always the case, standard deviation as well. It's not always the case that we're always focused on any one statistic. A statistic is a function of the data. And statistics is the science of using information that we collect and we call data into, please move me if I've lost. To help us take that information and turn it into sort of evidence about scientific phenomena or hypotheses, right? And so what each one of these proposals is trying to do in some respect is sort of take a data collection algorithm and accumulate some information and then turn it into information. And because the pilot, as Rich said earlier, we hope that part of turning that information into actionable evidence is about a definitive study to follow on to the project. Right? And some of you did a better job than others of sort of emphasizing that in your proposals, and so we'll talk about that a little bit. So there is a portion here, quantitative, that sort of goes along that definition. Some people do include qualitative science in their definition of something like statistics and data analysis, but I'm a quantitative science, so I can speak less appropriately to, or at least a little less intelligently about qualitative methods. All right, so this is the form of the slides that we'll show, which are declarative statements about things that you should do. Once again, recognizing that you're the authority on your research, right? So I'm illustrating this concept. Specific aims should be clear and simple and match the hypotheses if appropriate. So in your application, there was a section called aims and hypotheses, right? And they were like grouped together on purpose, right? And the aim, as stated in this application, was I will try to understand how does the A to F bundle combine with the diaries, modify the experience of the patients and so on in the ICU, and also the coping of patients and relatives after ICU. So specific aims should be clear and simple. I think this is clear. It's like clear what's happening, right? It's not a very quantitative statement, right? It talks about things like the experience, but it does have words like modify, and it also talks about an association in a manner of speaking, right? However, it's a compound statement, right? The and also, that's going to be tough on you, right? Because then the reviewer will say to you, okay, well, how do I know whether or not this sort of succeeded? This aim was satisfied if it has 2 components to it, right? And I'm not necessarily advising that it shouldn't. I'm just saying that oftentimes it's better to have 2 simple aims rather than 1 complicated or compound aim, right? Now you can run into problems because people will tell you, well, aim 2 shouldn't depend on aim 1. Right? And that's a big no-no, right? And so if you have if you are turning a compounding into two simple ones, but then in turn that gives you that problem, then you have to sort of make decisions, right? So life is choices, right? And your research life is choices about your research, right? So you'll have to make a choice there. But my advice would generally be two simple aims and hypotheses that go along with them, rather than one compounding where it's not really clear necessarily to an uninformed but intelligent reader precisely how success or failure would be defined. Also, another point, this is a must, and I put, so if it's in red, red is love or whatever, and also red is emphasis in this talk, right? So methods described must match methods proposed, right? This is a big problem in like sort of all of science, where we sort of say, we'll do the following, and this is the approach we're going to take in the abstract or in the general overview. You get down to methods, and it's like a whole other system of methodology, right? And that can be really frustrating for reviewers, and they tend to just like sort of put you on snooze, right? Even though you maybe don't deserve that, and this is like 9,000 years of, or person hours of your life is like embedded in these 12 pages, and it can be disheartening to learn that, you know, this kind of thing can really set people off and just make them impatient, right? We did a thought experiment recently, or I was trying to propose a thought experiment. You know how you submit a grant, it takes a really long time. So it takes too long to develop it. But what would be too short? Like if you could upload your application to the cloud and push a button, and 30 seconds later the answer came, whether or not, that would probably be too short. So somewhere in the middle is probably going to be a week, a year, I don't know, something. Somewhere in between like a week and like what it takes, the time is maybe the correct amount of time. And that reflects the fact that you wouldn't want the answer right away because of the amount of effort that you put in. Right? So do yourself the favor of making sure that part A and part C match up. So here, in methods it says, this is a qualitative study. It's a mixed method study. We evaluate delirium prevalence and its relationship with the A to F. So there's a prevalence estimate coming, and there's some kind of a relationship, a correlation or an odds ratio or something, right? And then it says statistical analysis not applicable and how are not applicable. So we're doing these computations, but how? Well, that's not applicable, which sort of reminds me of this sign, right? We're doing, we're going to do statistics, but we don't have any statistical methods, right? Now, it could be, that your statistics are just descriptive in computation. It may be that you're not actually doing any estimation or any inference about a background population. It could be, we're strictly going to compute and describe. Right? So when you have this clinical trial in the journal or JAMA or, you know, any journal, right? And you look at table 1, and it says, okay, here's the intervention arm, here's the control arm, and here's the age, 78, standard deviation 12, 77, standard deviation 10, right? That's just a description. There shouldn't be a p-value there because you're not testing some hypothesis about the population. It's two groups from the same population. You're just sort of describing them, right? And it may be that in your proposal, that's all you're going to do. You're not actually you're really going to compute the prevalence in your sample and sort of take it as like a fact that's relevant for your work, right? And then I would say, okay, then do that. Right. In the method, say, we will compute descriptive statistics, which will include the sample prevalence of the variant. We will look at this relationship, which in the following manner. Right? Even if you don't intend on confidence intervals and p-values and making conclusions or inference, one should still describe so that the methodology matches up with what you've said you're going to do. So this says that. All right, Dr. Holly had a very well-written proposal, develop delirium competencies for a transient volunteer workforce, a pilot study measuring temporary disaster shelter nurse volunteers' ability to recognize delirium. And appropriately, this application had 2 solid pages of just like description of the population in question and how to reach them and how they would be trained and so on and so forth. And so here are some hypotheses. There was a single hypothesis. Once again, it was a compound statement, but it wasn't linked directly to the 3 aims of the proposal, which are given here, right? But it still kind of reinforced points with them, and I thought in this particular application it was a stylistic choice to like lead with the hypothesis and say, and make it one statement. Not necessarily criticizing it, but again, a compound hypothesis, which sometimes people will give you a hard time about, right? These aims are very clear. They suggest quantitative targets. Some features of this is it's a survey project, and there is a pre and post test which implies some kind of a difference maybe, or a learning effect, and the word learning is used in describing the overall application in the abstract, excuse me. So, one slight problem I had, or not problem, but a complication is assume an unfamiliar audience, define some terms and objectives, right? So this proposal did a tremendous job, I thought, of like not assuming any baseline knowledge about what these transient work populations are, like in like the settings in which they would be deployed, how they can be taught, and it laid this out in great detail. Right? But then it talks about a pre and post test to measure baseline delirium identification knowledge and a post test to measure learning. So 2 words, knowledge and learning, that were going to be measured. And there was a promise explicitly, the word measure was given, but no like how, right? Which leaves us sort of wondering, you know, well, how are they going to do this? Have they not thought about it, right? And in a weird way, the amount of detail and care that was taken in laying out some of the ground rules could actually work against you in this situation, because you invested such effort in describing the population, who these people are, how they work, how we teach them. But then not getting right down to, okay, but at the end of the day, when you say they're going to learn, what does that mean? Right? Is it a difference between the post-test and the pre-test, or is the post-test a different thing? It's not like the pre-test, and because the pre-test is more about sort of gauging where they are, and the post-test is some kind of knowledge, capture, right? We don't, and there's no answer, right? And if the reviewers left to speculate, it's a really bad sign, because then when the review group starts speculating what maybe you meant, trouble. It's like 13 smart people in a room, they all disagree, everyone gets irritated with each other, that's fine, right? So just, again, explicate when you design your methods, make sure that the quantitative methods are delineated clearly, even if we. Another project by Dr. Mahana Gabrielli, Pathophysiology of Delirium in Patients Undergoing Total Joint Arthroplasty, Role of CBF, Cerebral Blood Flow, and Autoregulation. Very nice aims and hypothesis. And this was a cohort study with a time series and very beautiful pilot data. Right? But one concern I had, and again, focusing on areas for improvement, not saying that the application is terrible, just focusing on areas for improvement. So there, I would say a nice commandment for you to follow is focus on feasibility and pilot. Right? And this, while this was a very beautiful application and incredibly impressive pilot data, and a not very nice graphical display of that data, the aims were quite ambitious and almost seemed a little bit spectacular. Right? So it's a sample size calculation. This is a pilot study, so pointing that out right up front, that's great. Sort of motivating, there not being that many participants, right? Good. A sample size of 30 should yield 5 patients with postoperative delirium. And then in the aim 1, right up front, it says, we will determine if more than 10% decrease in intraoperative CBF flow, CBF increases the incidence of POD. So with 5 participants, we're going to increase the incidence and show a relationship, which is sort of like, come on, guys. Right, so now it may be that because you're using a time series and you talked about how people can come in and out of different states, that there's more power than is embedded in these 5, right? Maybe it's more than 5 events somehow because of the time series, but that's not dealt with at all in your computation, and you can't assume sort of that the reviewer will be nice to you. So I would have said maybe think about some of these points, which are very nicely that we assume 70% of patients will have POD. Assuming a normal distribution of change, 16% will fall one standard deviation below the mean, and so on and so forth. Well, you have the opportunity in the pilot to sort of decide whether or not these are realistic assumptions going into your definitive study. And I would say everything about this was beautiful, but I would have sort of scaled back the promises and the aims to something more about, can we do this work? Right? We sort of have shown it, here's some preliminary data, right? But we're still only going to get 5 with POD. So obviously there's still something to be learned, there's still something to prove, that's why we run a pilot, that's why we're proposing it, right? So bring those things to the fore, along with the beautiful preliminary data and science you've got thus far. Questions so far? Dr. Castro talked about a beautiful study of delirium in a pediatric intensive care unit. It's a validation study, right? And it talks about this SOSPD tool to do diagnosis in the PICU, right? And there are 3 aims, the third having to do with EEG and a so-called larger sample. Right? So that's a little bit of a red flag, and we'll get to that. Right? So this is a validation study in a very vulnerable population. So to me, I actually reviewed this in the mock study section of the proposal, and there was some variation you heard in terms of people feel how they felt about the significance. To me, the significance was more or less a no-brainer because the instrument exists, so it should be validated, right? And because of the high-risk population. But we could maybe lean into that a little bit more in the description. And then another thing that you've already had your review, so I'm not going to go into each and every positive and negative point, but one particular item that sort of took me aback was you were very honest in disclosing these obvious weaknesses, right? But then no plan to mitigate. Right? It was just sort of stated, and in fact, it was towards the end of the proposal, so it was sort of like the last thing you read, and it sort of left a certain impression in the mind. We will consider a convenience sample, and the motivation was because we have difficulties with the available time of the neurologist and the psychiatrist, i.e. our collaborators don't have a lot of time to do this work that we described, right? Which is a big uh-oh, right? And so there I would have said, okay, you need to take some time here to say, okay, let's make some lemonade out of these things. This study will show how in a very busy environment, with a very high-risk population, with people who have many different responsibilities and not many resources, and there's not a very strong base of research support. Even so, we are going to get magical results because we have designed it in such a way that even a convenience sample, even with the small amount of time these people have to dedicate to this work, we will still get valid results, right? So there's always a way to take something that's a limitation and through thinking it through, well, how can this be thought of as a positive? And then, in good faith, designing the study to make it a positive. Right? We want this to only impact people who have other duties. A neurologist has many other duties, right? And they have, their clinical care is priority A, right? We're involving them in the study to do this validation work, which is critically important, but it's only going to take X number of minutes a day for them because of the follow-up. Right? And so instead of just saying, you know, well, sorry, we have a convenience sample, it's the best we can do, kind of thing, it's more like, we have shown that even a convenience sample will be strong. Right? Make sense? So deal with this up front, explain why the convenience sample will produce valid results, as I said. Also avoided introducing greater doubt, which is what I said a moment ago. Don't sort of end with, here's a big limitation, like that. The first, Dr. Lee, had a very nice proposal called Antibiotics in POD, right? Aims are, again, very well laid out, and this project was like, incredibly ambitious, right? Involving microbiome and a lot of people. And so here, there were a couple of items I wanted to talk about. The project proposes in the 2 aims both a cohort study and a nested case control study. So 2 entire studies. Right? And that was in 1 aim, and then a whole other analysis on a subset of 40 individuals to do microbiome association. And finally, it's in a surgical population. And so my commandment for you here is to use caution in saying like what's possible, right? And so we're going to target 150 patients enrolled in comparing incidence of POD in the antibiotic cohort versus the non-antibiotic. Analysis will adjust for known risk factors, which include, I was trying to do this last night to think about how many variables this actually implies, and I was coming up with a minimum of like 18, right? And which is, again, really amazing if we could get statistical control of 18 factors, you know, based on 150 people. Now, it may be that this was only an interim sum and you're hoping to get more. Or it may be that not every one of these is actually a part of your more circumscribed concept model, but that didn't exist, right? So there was no way for me to sort of give you the benefit of the doubt that you will, you know, not look at all possible races if it turns out race is not really a factor, right? There's no really way that you said you would cull these. They were just sort of presented as strengths. But sometimes, again, being so thorough can actually work against you if in other areas you don't have the space to sort of delineate how you'll break that down, right? So in this situation, I would have probably advised as a collaborator to develop a more parsimonious concept as a figure, and to say, okay, all these things are potentially covariates or confounders, but the really important ones that we'll lead with are, for example, hypertension, or whatever they are. You listed, I think, 5 or 6 comorbidities, right? Well, maybe 1 or 2 of those are sort of the things that we're really concerned with that potentially could damage conclusions here. So promise adjustment only as necessary, adjusting for 17 or 18 things was a sample of 120. People have a ton of rules of thumb, like 10 people per covariate, things like this. I tend to think most of those rules of thumb are like catastrophically low. I mean, if you think of, okay, I wouldn't believe this was age adjusted, but now I have 10 people, so I can adjust for age. Age is a huge continuum, right? You know, and if you think about an 18-dimensional space of all possible values of hypertension and CAD, and then other comorbidities, and then age, and then sex, and so on and so forth, right? Imagining all those sort of sectors in that huge space being accounted for in the model is difficult to imagine. So people, even if you had twice as many, you sort of met that like 10-person per covariate rule of thumb, even there I would be cautious. Another thing is, what do we do when we control for factors? We imagine, okay, I'm holding type of anesthesia constant, but moving blood pressure back and forth. So I'm varying one while holding the other fixed, right? That's what it means to be independent statistically. Right? It's the effect of moving blood pressure intraoperatively is independent of anesthesia type because I'm using statistics to hold anesthesia type constant and think about blood pressure moving back and forth. Well, in certain scenarios, that may not make sense, right? And I don't have the expertise to know whether it's true in each one of these, but I might guess that intraoperative blood pressure and estimated blood loss are kind of related to each other, and it may not make sense to sort of fix one and make one move, right? An example of this, you'll see papers that talk about inflammation, right? And they'll put like 9 inflammatory markers into an analysis, right? Well, let me hold CRP constant and vary IL-6 and vary IL-2, or hold IL-2 and CRP and TNF-alpha constant, but vary, and does that even plausibly biologically that all these things would stay the same, but one would be moving back and forth, maybe not, right? So now you have to reckon with, you know, well, we don't really mean it that way, we mean it this other way, and so on and so forth. So just be cautious with laundry list of control factors, even in interventional science. Dr. Osterhaus's proposal had to do with EHR and identifying delirium using an EHR algorithm. Again, all of these were really well-written guys. They were all great writers, and you should be commended. Here are the aims and hypotheses. They're long. But the major design feature was that this was described as a retrospective observational study involving electronic health record and chart review. And one illustration, one comment I wanted to make that was violated here was establish the real world and clinical significance, even in the method section, right? Not only earlier on, right? But so it says in methods, we'll take differences between groups and you'll use a chi-square test and a t-test, and then if it's a significant difference, then X, Y, and Z will happen. But this is me saying, I don't care. And what? So what? It's statistically significant if I have no context for meaning, right? And now you're going to EHR, right? You have this chart review. A lot of the measurements may not be familiar to the reviewer, right? They may have, as we've discussed many times this week, maybe prejudicial or kind of bad ideas about the importance of this field in general. So you're like delirium identification through AHR, where okay, so now we're sort of like, maybe I don't necessarily believe, I think delirium's transient, I don't think it's that important, and you're measuring it through the EHR, right? So again, we want to make strength out of weakness. We can show that even though we're using the EHR, we can get to clinical significance by the following method, right? We have maybe anchored, right, the differences that we're testing for with like their, so who knows what anchoring is? Right? It's like sort of like imagining what a difference that you observe in delirium status or some predictor of delirium would mean on delirium or some downstream outcome like falls. You know, we can show that if you, through this algorithm, if you're 10% more likely to have the following risk factor, that translates to, you know, an odds ratio of 1.2 for mortality and or institutionalization over a 10-year period. That's called anchoring to a hard outcome like mortality. Right? That's one way to establish clinical significance if you don't already have it through something like an MCID, which I described before. Right? If in the total absence of that, in the total absence of any clinical context for you to like link onto or staple it to, then you can do with use like the reliability of the metric itself. You can say, okay, over time, it's just expected that if we just re-administer this thing, you know, the same circumstances to the same kind of person, there's just some noise in there. And this is about the level of that noise. Well, we're powered to detect an effect right down to that, but not beyond. And that would be the sweet spot. You're saying, okay, anything less than that is just, we'll conclude it's noise. But if we can see an effect greater than that, if it does exist in the wild, if the effect is really that great, we will see it in this study with this probability. Through our power computation, right? So that's getting a little beyond where you were, that's okay, right? But I would veer far away from just leaning on statistical significance without any clinical context compared to this scale. Additionally, this was a tricky study because of the design features that were clever and excellent and strong and made it strong, but were, I would say, suboptimally described. For example, up front, it says this is a retrospective observational study, which leaves the door open to many kinds of designs. Right? It could be a case control study, it could be a case cohort study, it could be a retrospective cohort study, and so on and so forth. Right? And then there was a sampling point made that we will look at 1,000 EHRs, right? 500 of which are coming from people who have delirium about ICD-9 and 10, and 500 that do not. So now, and then additionally, in the analytic plan, we talked about logistic regression to predict delirium status. Okay, so I'm sampling on the basis of the outcome in my model, right, which means it's a case control study. Right? I have cases and controls. I'm going to predict them with an analysis. I'm sampling on the basis of the outcome. That's what makes it a case control study. You can have a retrospective design that isn't case control. It can be retrospective, but look forward in time, right? And that would be a cohort study. And initially, when I wrote this slide, I thought it was, and then I read this sentence, and I said, oh, wait a minute, never mind, right? And part of that was because you talked about delirium predictors, which was not, in retrospect, that bad, but I would be a little cautious about, you didn't use the term risk, which I thought was great, because you're not looking forward in time and seeing risks, right? But then you also said we're going to differentiate cases of delirium from non-delirium cases, right? So this is a case control study, never declared. People with delirium are the cases, people without delirium are the controls, or some other term, not cases, right? Be very careful using the term case, right? And particularly if you have a cohort study, definitely don't describe incident events as cases. Like if I'm looking at if I have a clinical trial or just a cohort study with an exposure, people have the exposure, no they don't, they're walking through time, and I'm looking at fall rate, right? I'm going to talk about risk of fall. I'm not going to talk about fall cases. I'm going to talk about events of fall or some other terminology and not confuse the reviewer with this word case. So in this case, in this instance, as I say here, it appears the sampling is based on delirium. It appears that delirium is the outcome variable. Therefore, it's a case control study. Let's call this one group controls. Let's call this other group cases and use terminology. So just use care. Our second Dr. Lee, clinical prediction models to detect delirium in the ED. Right? Central hypothesis very well laid out and aims. And then this was a modeling study using the CDW, Clinical Data Warehouse. Right? So a lot of description of the modeling methodology in this proposal that I thought was very nice. And so here's an excerpt from the methods. The predictive ability of the features in the model will be summarized using the area under ROC curve. We will review the performance of the proposed prediction models by comparing AUC, AKT information criterion, and the net reclassification index to identify the best performing prediction model. And it's sort of like, so what does that mean, right? And what I mean by that is, on what basis will the model be judged well to do a good job, right? It sort of says there's a lot of how here, and like how we'll get there sort of, but no kind of basis for making the conclusion, right? And then if we are differentiating between candidate models, how we choose which one is better or not. Is one meaningfully better? Is there some external data set against which it will be validated? This was not laid out. So I would just say, set terms for the evaluation up front. And there's a lot of good reasons to do that. When I teach my students in a master's class in the evening for cash, I tell them step 0. We have like a 4-step way to do a data analysis. And step 0 is sort of set up your statistical hypotheses, and also part of that is setting up expectations. And it really helps you later on. Who here has ever done an analysis where like it sort of worked out? And you start trying to seduce yourself, like, you're like, well, maybe half the effect we wanted is all right, you know, just send us $500,000 more and we'll make sure, right? You know, and this kind of, and you can really protect yourself at every stage. Why are there so many type 1 errors? What's a type 1 error? It's when you discover an effect that isn't real, right? You find a relationship that doesn't bear out, and so much of the biomedical literature ends up being that way. And why is that? Is it because of fraud? Not really. Is it because people are stupid? Of course not. It's because at each and every stage of the research process and in your career, what is valued is what is novel, sexy, unheard of, different, never seen before, you know. Or another way to say it is fluky, accidental, lucky, probably wrong, right? You know? Right? So one way to protect yourself from that is to say, if we observe this level of difference, the interpretation is this. If we observe this level of difference, the interpretation is that, right? Way up front, right? And then sort of put it in a box and lock the box, right? And then later on do the analysis in sort of a semi-blinded fashion and try to think too much about sort of making yourself fall in those ranges, right? And then, you know, honestly sit with yourself and say, okay, you know, we anticipated the following. We saw half the effect. It's still statistically significant, maybe, but it isn't quite at the level that we hoped. However, here are the following mitigating factors. Right? And then write it with a good faith effort. And then the journals now are asking for your protocol. If it's in your protocol, and you give yourself room there, where you say, this will be the interpretation, you know, modulo the following potential complications, right? Then that gives you, like, JAMA is so much more motivated to publish your semi-negative study, because you just show good faith, you made it like reproducible and consistent with sound science, that you designed it in such a way that if it didn't quite work out, you still had some rules set before. Questions about this? Again, I'm on a soapbox here. You have to take it with a grain of salt. But this is my advice, my opinion. Second illustration from Dr. Lee's proposal, name your tools, right? So in the methods, here's that same paragraph, but even longer, right? Again, beautiful, clear description of methodology, providing the statistical reviewer has some familiarity with methodology, which they should, right? But right up front, it sort of says, the predictive ability of the feature of the model will be summarized using blah, blah, blah. And it never actually names the model. It never actually says, okay, this is a logistic regression, or it's a machine learning, or it's lasso, or it's support vector machines. There's some model here differentiating between two kinds of people, one who has a diagnosis and one who doesn't, right? So it's a binary endpoint. So I have a sense as a reviewer that there's a family of models that are applicable. And all these methods sort of are applicable to some or most of those methods, but I shouldn't be in a position of inferring what the model is called, like what's the basic method. So just be sure, name your tools, right? This is what the piece of the toolbox we're about to use. And ideally provide a reference, particularly if it's a sophisticated common model tool. Dr. Sheehan talked about AI to identify something. I slipped it. Identify what? Thank you. I'm on hospitalized medical patients. I must have cut and pasted 2 times. Sorry about that. All right.
I hope I put it in. I may have not. It might be my error. It's me. It's not you, right? It's me.
So I will take credit for cutting and pasting problems. Spellings. All right. Employ AI to develop an automated tool to identify delirium cases using all data available from admission to discharge. This proposal was again beautifully written and had the advantage of there was like significant work at the level of the group that Dr. Sheehan is in similar sort of investigations. And those were sort of laid out. And it said, development of delirium identification tool builds upon our previous work, blah, 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 yada, yada. Our collaborators have achieved 97%, greater than 97% accuracy in classifying complex conditions such as pulmonary embolism using these methods, which is impressive, most impressive, as Dr. Bader would say. So I would say show your work here. I would say I have a collaborator, Shali Bassine, who's a big-time andrologist, physical function person, like one of the people that like everyone would call if there was an emergency in that area. And he always is like badgering me to help me make a quote-unquote memorable figure, right? And I think this is really an example where you could have supported an incredibly impressive, almost dubious claim, right, with some data, right, or a picture or some combination of data and a picture. Very powerful way to do this is just to devise a figure and then have a table next to it, like as part of the same display, sort of showing the raw numbers and then showing it pictorially, right? Picture is worth way more than 1,000 words in this context, right? It always is, right? If you want to see your work on someone's slides, make a good picture, put it on there. So I think that you could have done this here. You had this, like, really, it just jumped left off the page, greater than 97% accuracy. Minor criticism here is that you didn't really define accuracy, right? Meaning, parentheses, quote unquote. Again, writing for a person who's intelligent but not really informed by your work, or even maybe your area of science, right? They sort of are qualified to read it, right? But maybe not necessarily qualified to pass judgment about it unless you really help them, right? And so as Lucy said, give them the tools to make a good faith evaluation in your favor. So what are the themes that we've sort of covered in this diatribe? This is for pilot studies, right? Make sure you have either demonstrated in the application or the application is oriented toward, or some mixture of both, feasibility. The ultimate goal is not to produce the definitive results in this area. It's to make it such that the definitive study can be done by you, hopefully, or by someone, if not, right? If not you. Write as if to an intelligent but uninformed colleague, or as I say to sometimes like a smart high schooler, right? Like a person who is science literate but doesn't really know your area, right? Some of the proposals overindulge in, for example, the use of acronym. Not a lot, but there was some of it, And so just be cautious that even though you knew you were writing for the delirium-centric environment today or this week, you're not always doing it. Be very clear and certain about your design. I can't emphasize this enough, how much of a problem it will be for you if you describe, a clinical trial that isn't randomized as a randomized clinical trial, or a cohort study as a case control study or something. It just can really get you big time trouble, because two things are communicated. One is you're a little confused, which is not a mortal sin, right? That happens. Right, but the second thing is you haven't had the attention of your collaborators, who are the people who are in charge of that part of the work. And that communicates that down the road they will continue to be inattentive, because of X, Y, or Z reason. Right? Very much lean on your data and relative experience and use pictures to show this. Right? If you have that very impressive statistic, you can say, look, this is like our bread and butter, this is right in our wheelhouse, many other metaphors signifying that it's what we do. Right? Then try to show that pictorially and not just have it sort of disappear into a paragraph of prose. And finally, make clinical significance very clear and very definitive. So I made a pilgrimage to see Joe Melton at the Mayo. He's a big bone person, and I was a young person working in the area of osteoporosis. And we talked about, what can we do to get funded? And he said, well, first of all, one day a week write. Try to close off everything. And the second thing is like the first or second sentence, or maybe the first sentence of your second paragraph of the proposal. You must fund this application because, right? So that's the clinical significance shining. Right? If this is not done, the world will end, tsunami and so on and so forth. Like great tragedy will ensue if this is not done, right? So therefore,
it should be done for the following reason, and then that should carry through all the way into the methods, right? So when you're down to your methods, don't treat it as something that sort of sits second. This is really a point for your collaborators too, and sometimes it's very difficult to get them up to speed, right, on why this is so critical and what these sort of critical elements are that would make it successful or meaningful. Right? You have to kind of spoon feed them some of the time. Right? These are the papers they should read. This is the knowledge they should have. And depending on the luxury you have of having a reasonably good collaborator or not, you may have to sort of force it into them. Right? But make sure they're not presenting results that are like just strictly statistical significance. Do your own best review. So now we're feeling much more happy about experimental design, right? Armed with these slides, I'm sure that you all will do tremendously well. So thank you very much.